just talking a little bit about your wife, Krista. You guys got married in 2018, and just the different potholes that you guys faced. And we're going to talk through one of your articles today. This article is Conversations to Avoid a Wedding Night Nightmare. I am very curious to hear all of your thoughts around this article, kind of starting with, who did you write this article to? I think we can all guess based on the title, but who did you write to?
Yeah, so ultimately this article is for any couple that is engaged, right? Regardlessly of whether you're young, you're older, or this is your second marriage, right? But I had a special heart in my mind and my heart when I was writing it for Christian couples, right? Those couples that have grown up in the church the entire life and have based the reasons that they're getting married about Jesus and about wanting to reflect his love that marriage is. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I wrote this to my younger self. All the information that I know now, I wanted to tell him, this is what you needed to know, and things that you needed to work through before you got married, and before that very special night, because it can be scary, and that's totally okay.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned this, you touched on it, but just when you're a young Christian couple, often when you're raised in the church, there's kind of these unrealistic expectations around that wedding night. And, I guess my question would be just, why is that? Like, why is the church, oftentimes, like, why do they struggle to talk through this? And why are there so many unrealistic expectations around that night for mostly Christian couples?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why there's sometimes unrealistic expectations is that there's a lack of education for Christian young people, right? Education in the home and education at church, right? And I've heard from a lot of people, not only my peers, but also people that I work with, that all the education that they had around sex was, don't do it, sex is bad, right? Whether that's from mom and dad or from the church, save sex for marriage.
But, I remember the youth events, where they would split guys and girls, and it would just be this big, like, purity talk, and not that that's not important, but I remember it being a very, like, touchy subject, almost where, like, you couldn't talk about it with a guy and a girl in the same room. And girls, like, you can't wear anything that's going to cause him to stumble. Guys, like, sex is bad, don't even go near it. Like, all of that stuff that was just, kind of scary. Like, it kind of makes it scary.
Yeah. And so with that tension that we feel there, right, when we do have questions, our mind automatically thinks like, oh, I shouldn't be having these questions about the sexual relationship, right? And so I'm not going to ask at all. I don't feel safe to ask them, right? And that comes from the culture within the church, right? And ultimately, this is a larger picture issue that we have to deal with, is like being able to have the church be a safe and comfortable place, because there's many other topics that don't feel safe, right? So whether we're talking about sex or whether we're talking about God's grace, we want the culture in our youth groups, in our churches, to be one of safety and security, where we can ask questions and not feel like they're stupid, honestly. And sometimes that's not always the case. And then a lot of times, the education around sex is always front end loaded, right? We are told to not do it, right? Because God said not to, which is all true and good. Like the message behind it is good and what should be taught, right? Save that sexual intimacy for marriage. But what doesn't happen is a large education on what the reasoning is and what happens after marriage, right? One of the reasons, and we may get more into this later, that God commands us to save sex for marriage is not because he has a low view of sex because it's bad, right? Because he has such a huge and such a high value of the sexual intimacy, right? Because as we look all the other relationships that we have in life, there's many different stages of intimacies, right? And we participate in that type of intimacy with other people that we're around with, and not just our spouse, right? So one of the things that I like to think about in intimacy, and this comes from Dr. Douglas Rosenau, is the three colors and circles of intimacy, right? So the first one is green, and this is a very biological intimacy. So this is a deep friendship, right? We know this person, we know what they're going to say and what they're going to do, right? And we know what they're made up of, right? And this is crucial not to friendship, but also our marriage relationship, right? And then out of that intimacy flows what's called purple, was like a coupling type of intimacy, right? Very royal, like this is special, right? That's marked with like hand holding, kissing, things like that. And like for Americans, that seems like that you only do those things with your couple, right? With your significant other. But we forget that we still hold hands and hug and maybe even kiss our moms or parents. And in other cultures, it's perfectly acceptable to have those kisses too, right? So even in that intimacy is shared with other people, right? Mm. But the last circle is that circle of orange intimacy, which is the erotic intimacy, which is the sexual intimacy. And it's only shared with our spouse. That's why, because it shows what commitment we have to the other person, that this is a special thing that I've saved, that only God has commanded me to share with you. And I'm going to share it with you. And we're just totally vulnerable and excited and playful that only this person gets to see of me, right? And that's why God calls us to save sexual intimacy until marriage, because he thinks it's huge, because it's the commitment to the other person.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing something one time kind of about the laws and commandments that the Lord gives, and it kind of saying like they're not given to prevent us, and to like, hold us back and enslave us. They're meant to protect us. They're meant to, for example, like when you're talking about, saving sex until you're married, that is so that we can have a more playful experience, a more comfortable experience to protect the sacredness of that relationship.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So kind of back to, I guess, the way that the church often responds to these things. Do you have any, tips for maybe church members watching this and trying to navigate having those conversations with their youth group or with people? How can the church do a better job of handling those wedding night expectations?
Yeah, I think one is to be honest, right? To be authentic. Because sometimes, especially for like youth group leaders, there may be a shame, right? Because they maybe didn't follow these not these rules, but did not save sex for marriage or have a past with it, right? And it feels really shameful, right? But ultimately, that's okay, right? What you did was wrong, but that's okay. Your story can be used as a way to direct other people, saying, hey, this is what I did, and this is how it affected me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the best teacher is your story and your authenticity and what you've experienced around these things. Even if it's just, I have one friend who, her sister had a really hard time with the fact that a family member ended up having an unplanned pregnancy and things like that. And it was really difficult for her. And so even that experience, maybe it wasn't directly her, but kind of indirectly a part of her family and did affect her.
Yeah.
So good. So let's get back to your article, conversations that we should be having with that significant other before the wedding night. So tell me real quick, is there a right or wrong time to have that conversation? For example, like say someone is in a very serious relationship, they've been dating for a couple years, but they're not engaged yet. Should they still not have that conversation? Is it a conversation you can have at the beginning, or should you have it when you're engaged, or should you have it the week before you get married? When do you have that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some wrong and right times to have this conversation, right? This is not a conversation I would want to have with somebody I've been dating for 2 months, right?
Yeah, that would be weird.
Yeah, a little bit. We're just getting close. We just went out to ice cream for the second time. Tell me about your sex life. Right.
All right. So now that we're sitting here at a Cold Stone ice cream, I feel like I can ask you these questions.
Yeah. But I think when you start to see yourself as like, this is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with, right? And that can be engaged, right? But that can also be before engagement, right? Because especially for homeschoolers, right? And people from generally the Midwest where I come from, A lot of times people aren't dating just to date, right? And they're doing that with the intentions of getting married, and they know they're going to get married years before they get engaged, right? And so I think it's acceptable to have that conversation then when you know that this is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with.
Yeah.
I would encourage you not to have this conversation like the week before you're married because of a couple of the questions there, like especially around like pornography, because that's something we have to work through, right? If any significant other has a pornography addiction, that can contraindicate the marriage relationship and really start it on a shaky footing. And so I would encourage you to be able to have it in advance to the wedding day, but right, but not right at the beginning.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's great. And I think it can also, it doesn't have to happen all in one sitting, right? Like,
No.
I think it's also important to realize that like sometimes it's a gradual process of, hey, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to tell you a little bit about my history. A
Yeah.
few months later, hey, I want to talk a little bit about what you think about the purpose of sex and things like that. Just kind of a gradual,
Mm-hmm.
natural. I think we want it to be a natural conversation. We don't want it to be, some sort of weird like, hey, let me like just attack you with all of these very intense, heavy questions.
Exactly. And so the setting on that, the setting is huge, right? Like what I'm thinking, like for a lot of college relationships, don't have this in the cafeteria. Just don't, right? And don't do it when you're tired, right? So be able to be conscious about when we're going to have this. What's the setting? Are we in the mental space, um, individually and relationally, to be able to have this conversation?
Yeah. So, what questions are helpful when you're talking to your partner about their sexual history? You kind of start with that in your article. What questions are helpful to ask?
Yeah, so one that really gets us off like on the right footing, it kind of helps us kind of see where the other person is coming from, is what was your education like on sex, right, growing up? For a lot of people, that was James Dobson's Focus on the Family's books, right? Or parents
That
just
would be
taking to them and
me.
say, don't ask questions, just read it and you'll be okay, right? Or maybe mom and dad were from the medical field or talked more mechanistically about sex, right? But didn't talk about the emotional intimacy, right? And this also helps us see like, did school talk about it? Did we have sex education at school? Did my church talk about it? Because for some people, the answer is yes on all three, or the answer is no. It just
Yeah.
depends.
I do feel like that's such a great place to start the conversation because I think it's a good segue into other things. Well, I was learning about this, when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I noticed that like 16 or 17, like this was happening. You know what I mean? I feel like it's a
Yeah,
very segue to like continue talking.
yeah. And then what that also does, starting on that foot, like it undoes a lot of aloneness, right? Because there's a lot of times I know for me growing up where I'm like, oh, I had the only version of my sex education was only for me, right? But as I've gotten older, I'm like, oh, I realized other people had the same type of sex education, right? Which is great. It worked. It helped, right? And it's what my parents offered me, and that was enough at that time. But there's some things as we get older and we felt like we couldn't talk about it, whether it's at home or at church, that we learn from other places. So it's helpful to be able to know where those beliefs about sex came from.
So good. Yeah. Any other questions? Obviously you mentioned a few different points in your article, but anything else you would want to kind of highlight?
Yeah, I think the other one I would want to highlight is asking about addiction to pornography, right? And not so much as like the pornography piece, but the lustful thought piece of it, right? This can give us a skewed version of what sex is going to be like and the purpose of the sexual relationship, right? And it rewires our brain, right? We see in a lot of brain scans with people who are addicted to pornography and cocaine, them being the exact same, right? And so it's really important to talk about that, be honest about it, right? There's no shame, right? We're not trying to make you feel guilty, right? But this is something that's going to affect your relationship. And your spouse can come close to you and make you feel firm that it's okay,
Yeah.
right? And help be along your side as you enter recovery to this, right? And it will make this sexual relationship even better.
Yeah, so good. So one other thing that you mentioned is important to talk about in this conversation is the purpose of sex, what you perceive
Mm-hmm.
individually to be the perfect purpose of sex. Is it to enjoy each other? Is it to procreate? You know what I mean? Like we all have kind of our own idea of what the purpose is that usually comes from what we grew up learning about around this. So why is it important to talk about that? Why is it important to talk about the purpose of sex?
Yeah. Like you said, Tori, because we all come from different church backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, right? We will all have a different view, a different lens that we see the purpose of sex from, right? There's some very conservative Christians that will say that the purpose of sex is only for procreation, right? And it is how you want to interpret the Bible, like go for it, right? I don't want to condemn that view, but it's helpful when we come together, right, as a couple to understand where we're coming from, what we already believe, and to be able to talk together through scripture and other materials to know what we believe the purpose of sex is and how we're going to live that out in our relationship, right?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's really good. So the next point that you kind of mentioned is talking through expectations of behavior. Can you kind of
Mhm.
expand on that? As it's mentioned in the article, why does it matter that we address
Mhm.
expectations for behavior?
Yeah, I think the one of the reasons why this is important is because we get a lot of view of what sex is like from like TV, movies, Hollywood, right? And then, like I said, pornography as well. They there was a study done with butterflies, right? So this researcher got a male and female butterflies, and then he made cardboard butterflies that were larger and more vibrant than the females, right? And what he discovered was all the male butterflies try to mate with the females that were cardboard,
Mm,
right? And so what that reinforces that um, it was super normal, right? It was above what was normal. And that's what Hollywood and pornography promote abnormal, supernormal behavior, right? Hollywood doesn't show people tripping and falling under underwear or clothes not coming off as smoothly as we thought it was, right? And if that's our
right.
expectations, right, that we're going to do all these things the first night, right? As your spouse, I'd like to know what you're expecting for the first night, right? So we know how to come together and be on the same page, right? There is not a right list of what should happen on the first night, right? My goal for you is to be able to see that let's get on the same page so we're a team and we enter this together and everyone feels comfortable and we have an amazing first night, regardlessly of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that is a really selfless kind of way to respond to this conversation and just being like, hey, what are your expectations for my behavior? And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that's such a beautiful way to start your marriage, to start that wedding night,
Mm-hmm.
is to really be caring about the other person and
Yeah.
really be mindful of what they expect, of what they're afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a really beautiful way to start a marriage.
Yeah, because what this is also doing, this is reinforcing the Ephesians 5:23 to 34 principle of being sacrificial, right? Of dying to myself, what I want, right? But putting the other person first,
Mm,
right? And I'm looking to mainly husbands on this one. Like, guys, you should not be forcing your wife to do anything she doesn't want to, right? Just don't do that, right? And what this is reinforcing is that submission of dying to yourself and putting your wife first,
yeah.
which you will be doing for the rest of your life. And it's amazing how that reflects God's love as well.
Yeah, so good. So going back to that wedding night, um,
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking back to, my wedding night, to other people's wedding nights, friends of mine, and I'm realizing more and more that so many women expect pain on their first,
Yeah.
and so many women almost associate sex with pain before they've even
Mm-hmm.
had sex. So my
Yeah.
question to you would be, how can women kind of avoid that? How can they kind of talk themselves up to, where it should be? And then also, what advice would you give to a husband who has a new wife who's fearful?
Yeah. Well, first, like one of the reasons that we do expect pain, right, when we first like have sex, right, is a lot of women, right, have poor experiences with tampons when they first use it, right? And so in our brain, when something enters into us, it's automatically like, this is going to be painful, right? And so there's already that reinforcement. And so that's why maybe some people, not all, but some have that expectation of pain because the first time we did anything, there was pain there, right? So what I would recommend, again, this is not going to do all pain, but this will set you up for success, is to one, visit your gynecologist, right? Do that before. And so we can kind of see if there's any abnormalities or not, right? And then also practice Kegel exercises. They were developed about 50 years ago by Dr. Arnold Kegel. Um, and so what there are, they're just our pelvic muscles, right? Our muscle. And so if they've never been used very much, they're going to be stiff and tight. And so when we're practicing Kegels, that will get things warmed up and strengthened. So when we do have sexual intercourse for the first time, we'll be more ready, right?
Mm-hmm.
That will be something that helps. Again, these things won't take away from all pain, but it'll help set us up for success.
So true. Yeah. And I think it genuinely, and speaking into it as a woman,
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's going to be different, of course,
Mm-hmm.
because you've never experienced it before. But also, it really is one of those like practice makes perfect kind of things, and the
Exactly.
more that you do it, and also the closer you guys become emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
in marriage and more comfortable you get living together, the
Exactly.
easier it is and the less tense you are.
Exactly.
Which I think is it's just great to realize that if it doesn't go well your first night, or if you're
Mhm.
nervous about it right now, it's not always going to be like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The sexual intimacy piece of marriage is not a light switch, right? It's on a dimmer switch,
Hmm.
right? We're
That's good.
not going to,
That is a great picture.
things. Yeah, we're not going to be able to come in and flip it on the first time and everything be bright and beautiful, right? But it takes time to slowly bring up the brightness of the light and as we get more comfortable, right? Um, so if it doesn't go to the expectations that you thought it was, that's okay, right? You're going to enjoy it way more 50 years from now because you have that closeness with your spouse. So, men, first off, be low and slow, right? Do not force things, right? So, keep constantly talking with your spouse saying, hey, is this okay? Does this feel good, right? She's the one that's going to coach you, right? Into what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And then coach her what feels good and doesn't feel good, right? Keep the lines of communication open, be slow and patient, right? Especially on that first night. And know that ultimately you love her for more than just the sexual relationship. And there might be times when you need to reinforce that, hey, I love you no matter what, regardlessly of what this experience is like, right? Um, I will work through anything with you.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. I just think of just the importance of being so patient
Mhm.
in that night. And just, I think of as a woman, what I maybe needed and wanted on that night was just someone to, you know, make me feel beautiful and make me
Yeah.
feel comfortable in that moment. Um,
Mhm.
you know, yeah, totally. So good. So on to kind of a more funny question.
Yeah.
Weddings can be exhausting, right? So you
Mhm.
talk about this in your article, how exhausting that wedding day can be and how it can kind of feel maybe a little anticlimactic heading into that wedding night. You're like
Yeah.
all sweaty from dancing, you're like
Yep.
your makeup smeared, like you don't
Yeah.
feel cute anymore, you're kind of tired, all of that stuff,
Mhm.
right? You're hungry because you didn't eat your whole wedding reception,
Yeah. I really
whatever.
know people that actually eat the wedding cake. Like, let's be honest now.
Oh, totally. No, we didn't even, I never had a cupcake. Like I mean, you get back to your hotel and you're both just sort of drained. So my question is, what do you do if one or both people don't want to have sex that night?
Know that that's normal and okay, right? I
Yeah.
mean, um, we don't want to do it tired, right? When we want to try something new for the first time, we're not going to do it when we're like exhausted, right? Because it's not going to
So
go well,
true. Yeah.
right? If I was to try like baseball to ride a bike for the first time and I do it like at 10 o'clock at night after I spent the whole day, I'm gonna probably wreck, right? So
Right.
if I'm not ready emotionally, right? or physically, that's okay. Just
Right. And I think
enjoy being with each other.
it can be so overwhelming. I mean, yeah, it can just be so overwhelming and not the way it was designed to be. You know, if
Mhm.
you are just kind of rushing into it and like doing it because it's expected, then you're doing it
Mhm.
because of expectations and not necessarily because you're ready and
Yeah,
excited for it.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, because what's happening to us physically, right? We've been on an adrenaline high for the last probably 24 hours, like since the wedding night reception,
Right.
right? The wedding reception, rather. And after we're done, we walk into our hotel room or a house or wherever, right? Our body's going to just dump all of that. It's just going to be, I'm done and stressed out. So it's normal for our bodies to feel tired.
Yeah. Oh, I remember it. I remember we walked in, we opened up all our cards and our gifts and just sat on the bed, like wedding clothes on, just kind of tired, like opening up some cards before anything because we were
Yeah.
so tired and we just needed to like sit down.
No, that's exactly how like Chris and I were. We both kind of walked in, we looked at each other, we're like, not right now.
Yeah.
Like,
Like, give me a minute. Like,
yeah,
let me get my makeup wipes, please. Like,
yeah. She's like, can we wait? I'm like, yes, 100%, please. I'm so tired.
you're like, yes. Oh my gosh. I was hoping you would say that.
Exactly.
Totally. Totally. So, last question around this. Speak directly, Lane, to the engaged couple watching. Kind of
Mhm.
give them some encouragement around the wedding night, this conversation that they are going to be having.
Yeah. Yeah. So first, my heart's so happy for you guys. Marriage is awesome. Marriage is such a wonderful time. And so is the sexual relationship, right? You will never be this close to someone ever again. And even though these conversations may be hard, and marriage will be hard down the road, know that the other person's there for you. And ultimately, God's there for you because the marriage relationship reflects His love that He has for us, for His church. And that undying love is the same love that you will experience for your spouse. And know that Christ will get you through it. He'll help you if you lean on Him. And just be open and honest with your spouse.
That's really beautiful.